There are four main ingredients to taking photos. And some of these transfer over to videos, but there'll be a separate video for that. There's aperture, ISO, shutter speed, and white balance. I notice in a lot of videos they miss that last one, white balance, but it's also just as important as the other three. And we'll get into why later in the video. Today, all the photos and all of the demonstrations will be on and shot on the Canon 80D with the 50mm lens 1.8, which is also known as the Nifty 50. If you want to get something that will kind of give you more leeway into figuring out how your camera works between, wide aperture and a small aperture, I would recommend picking up one of these Nifty 50s. They're only like $100 and they are a great tool, especially when you're beginning your journey into photography. First, I want to talk about aperture. Aperture is how much light is being let into the camera. And this is decided by the lens that you have on your camera. It's usually measured in f-stops and can be seen on the front of the lens. Like in this Nifty 50, it says it on like the outer ring. Sometimes it's a little within the lens itself, but it's pretty easy to find. This is, in my opinion, probably the most confusing setting because it changes per lens, and what lens you have determines how much light you can let into the camera. So they have lenses all the way from a 0.95 to 64. So f 0.95 to f64, and there's a whole group of photographers called the f64 group that we can go into in another video. The most confusing part about aperture is the smaller the number, the bigger the aperture. It's a little reversed. So the bigger the number, the smaller the aperture. The smaller the number, the bigger the aperture, or the wider the aperture. So for the lens that we have today, the lowest aperture number it can go to is 1.8, which means it can let in a lot of light. It's going to open up very wide. And with this lens as well, we can go up to an f22, which is a very small amount of light being let in to the camera. When you're shooting a landscape photo, you most times want to have a small aperture because it allows you to have a larger depth of field. So more things in focus. If you ever see some landscapes or wide shots in movies where they have the subject and the background in focus, it's usually shot with a higher aperture. And what I mean by that is the number is higher, so a smaller hole in the lens. With shooting portraits, a lot of people want to achieve that blurry bokeh in the background and having their subject or their face in focus. How you achieve this is opening the aperture up all the way and letting in as much light as possible. This will allow you to have a shallower depth of field. Now, when you do this, you'll notice that the image is going to be way blown out. It's going to be very bright, and maybe you won't even be able to tell you're taking a picture of, and that's okay. You didn't break it. It's just letting in a ton of light. And how you counteract this is with the next two. First being the shutter speed. Shutter speed is how fast your photo is taken. If your shutter speed is too slow, the more motion blur, and the faster the shutter speed, the crispier the moving object will be. So in this example, you can see that I'm blurry, and this is because I'm moving while the shutter speed is a bit slower. Now, if I were to take that same photo, but with a faster shutter speed, you can see that around the edges, It's more still. I'm more captured in the moment. This is used for sports photography or car photography and things like that. And when you take a fast shutter speed and a wide open aperture, as mentioned in the previous point, that's how you create that blurry background. I'll throw up some more examples of this. This is a picture taken with a wide aperture and a fast shutter speed. As you can see, the background is blurry and the subject is in focus. Everyone that I've ever talked to thinks this is beautiful. Now, of course, you don't have to follow this, because here's another example, that same photo, just with the aperture closed more and the shutter speed slower. As you can see, the subject is in focus and also the background is in focus. Whatever you want to do, it's up to you. The third ingredient, if you will be ISO. It trips up a lot of people, especially beginners in photography. It causes a lot of problems if you don't know what it means or what it does. ISO could also stand for ASA, but in each camera, digital camera, they have sensors, because there's a computer in the camera and there is a light sensor, and your ISO controls how sensitive to light that sensor is. Some cameras can handle extremely high ISOs, like 12,400, and they'll be totally fine. Most cameras, especially ones that you get when you first start, are not going to be able to handle that much ISO and produce a clean image. What ends up happening when you first start is like, oh, my image is too dark, so you crank up your ISO. Sure, that makes sense in your mind, but then your image just kind of comes out looking like this. You can see there's a lot of grain, a lot of artifacts, a lot of sometimes discoloration, and this is because you're blowing out the image. Now, you can attempt to fix this in post, but it's not really going to work. Now, how you want to control your ISO depends on the other two settings to compensate or adjust your brightness. Now, for the most part, these three, if you go out and take photos with these three things in mind, you're going to be fine. But the fourth important point that I feel as though is overlooked is your white balance. Most cameras today have presets for white balance: daylight, shade, cloudy, tungsten, fluorescent light, and flash. And then some have custom. With these presets, they do a pretty decent job at whatever setting you're in to get your image white balance correct. A lot of people just turn to auto white balance, which is fine if that's what you want to do. That's totally up to you. I personally think that you learn easier and faster when you're doing it and trying to set your white balance using one of the presets. And what white balance does to your image is what our eyes do naturally throughout life. So a good example and a good way to think about this is in the wintertime, if you ever walk into like a coffee shop or your house and you look outside and the outside looks kind of blue, looks kind of cold. And then if you go walk outside again, the lights will have some kind of warmer hue to them. Your eyes automatically adjust the white balance so that what you're looking at appears white in your environment, immediate environment. Your camera does this, but doesn't do it automatically. Now, it does have an auto setting, like I said, but it's not always the most reliable, and maybe you don't want it to be, exactly what it should be. Adjusting this will help you get the images to look more what they would look like in real life, what you're seeing versus what the camera's seeing. And the best way to learn how to use this is just to go out in different lighting scenarios like golden hour or at night or indoors using studio lights or natural lighting. It's all trial and error until you kind of get an idea of what is going to be used where. And the names are pretty self-explanatory, at least on this camera. Daylight during the day, shade during the shade, and so on. Now, using your white balance will give it a cooler or a warmer tone. And again, that all depends on what you want your image to look like. So I know that was a lot of information, and it can be, like I said, overwhelming. You know, there are plenty of tutorials out there, whether they're mine or somebody else's, and feel free to watch as many times and as many videos as you need. I remember when I first started, I actually wrote things down and I would carry a notebook on me whenever I went out and took photos so that I could reference that to remember which setting meant what. So with that being said, photography is art, and art is subjective, and art can be whatever you want it to be. And I don't want to sound preachy, but just because there's a way you're supposed to take a picture doesn't mean that you have to take a picture specifically how I said it or anybody else says it. If you want to crank your ISO all the way up to make it as grainy as possible, and that's what you like, you take those photos. A lot of people will tell you that you have to take your photos with a certain setting, a certain white balance, and whatnot. But you don't have to do that. If you like your temperatures of your photos to be warmer or cooler, then you can do that. This video is more or less a guide onto the basics and the foundation so that you can learn these settings and then change them once you're more comfortable with them. So I hope this video was helpful to anybody who watched it. Please share it with anybody who is getting into photography if you feel that this will help them. Please like and subscribe. I'm gonna hopefully come out with more videos and more structured videos in the future. And I don't really know how YouTube works, so I'll just be figuring it out as we go. And yeah, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.